Welcome to our Leaving Hospital Well Community of Practice webinar, Streamlining Health and NDIS for Better Discharge Outcomes. My name is Virginia Mitch, and as the Summer Foundation's Collaborative Hospital Discharge Lead, I'll be co-facilitating the session today, along with my colleague, Michelle Bush, who is the Summer Foundation's Health Engagement Lead. Oh wow, we have a huge number of clinicians and providers joining us today. We've been overwhelmed by the response. Thank you so much. And it kind of indicates to us that we all share in a collective community, and that of the health and the NDIS interface. And whether we work regionally, in large metropolitan hospitals, in different states or across different clinical streams, we all share that same goal of streamlined discharge practices to achieve positive outcomes for the person with disability in hospital and leaving hospital, and leaving hospital working towards their preferred long-term housing option. So our goal for today is that through the information we share, including stories of practice change, you hear what's possible. You take that to reflect on where you may be as a clinician, where your health service may be in this health and NDIS interface. And then this reflection then, I guess, may mould your action plan going forward. For those of you who have just joined us, the way you can interact with us is through the chat function and through the Q&A function. Q&A is for questions. If someone's already put up a question you like, upvote it, and that gives us a prompt to use those questions in our panel discussion. I'd like to hand over to Michelle. She's going to start with providing some background on the projects, really giving the context for our panel discussion.
Thanks, Virginia. With the introduction of the NDIS and pilot trials at Barwon Health in Victoria, there was early recognition by the Summer Foundation that the health and the NDIS interface needed attention to maximise NDIS discharge practice and to achieve better outcomes for people with a disability. From early 2017, the Summer Foundation, via funding through the William Buckland Foundation, began a 3-year project in order to identify the design of an optimal NDIS collaboration discharge planning approach for people with a disability. Whilst this was occurring, further NDIA information linkages and capacity building funding enabled the Summer Foundation to deliver an NDIS training in a number of health services around Australia. Through the delivery of this training, it was realised that for increased knowledge to occur and real practice change, and to avoid the negative outcomes that were occurring, that a framework for NDIS and health, NDIS capacity building was required. Alongside this, health services were sharing their own experiences, and some in particular, such as the Austin Hospital, led by Bryn Lewin, began identifying the critical elements required to maximise the NDIS and health interface. Drawing on health services experiences and NDIS providers, we at the Summer Foundation developed an NDIS and health capacity building framework. This framework became the building block to streamline the discharge experience for people who were eligible for the NDIS. With funding from the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria, this framework was actioned through the Leaving Hospital Well project. This project aimed to engage and support capacity building with a change management lens for sustainable practice change in the NDIS interface. Alongside this, the Collaborative Discharge Approach, or the CDA, was formalised in 2019. This modelled the learnings from the William Buckland project, the ILC training, and also the DHHS projects, and was expanded and trialled at South Western Sydney, Austin, and Alfred Health in Victoria. I'll now provide an overview of the key elements of the NDIS and health capacity building framework. However, these will be further demonstrated throughout the panel discussions. Firstly, we found that executive support for NDIS capacity building was proven to be vital to ensure a top-down approach and to create momentum for change. An appointed NDIS executive portfolio lead was also important to hold accountability for the change and drive the capacity building within the organisation. It was found that those health services who invested in a dedicated NDIS project lead or specialist role were more successful and faster moving with NDIS change than those that didn't. Dedicated resources have been found to be worth the investment, leading to quicker NDIS-related discharge outcomes and hence less impact on length of stay. Provision of secondary consultation, updating resources in a rapidly changing environment, and being a key point of NDIS-related communication to staff have also been notable outcomes. Alongside these points, NDIS governance structures, including the setup of an NDIS steering committee that included members from the whole health service, was vital. Those health services that implemented a steering committee found that NDIS capacity building was less siloed, and with regular meetings held, actions were followed up more rapidly, leading to faster change. For those health services who didn't have a dedicated NDIS project lead, the steering committee was even more important to ensure a coordinated and shared response to change. A whole of health service approach was critical in maximising continuity of care and building trust in colleagues to follow agreed NDIS processes from acute to subacute and onto the community. Although there was a subset of clinicians where NDIS is their bread and butter work, it was found that it was important to create a culture that the NDIS is a health clinician's core responsibility across all continuums of care. The outcome of this is access starting as early as possible to ensure supports are in place and available to prevent unnecessary burden on inpatient beds. To ensure sustainability of best practice NDIS processes, NDIS-specific policies and procedures were imperative. This included things like an NDIS operational or practice guideline, an NDIS flowchart, an NDIS internal and external escalation pathway, and a roles and responsibilities guideline, without which consistency of practice was unlikely, and a lack of guidance to staff led to a lack of confidence and low staff wellbeing. NDIS-specific tools and templates, such as a pre-planning template, was also important to get the best outcomes for people applying for the NDIS. All of these resources were best placed in a central location, such as an NDIS intranet page, to ensure easy access and to prevent siloing of NDIS practice across the organisation. Integration into existing operational processes, including screening new admissions for NDIS eligibility or existing participants, was important. Examples included NDIS status being included in an admissions checklist and daily discussion in team meetings such as handover, rapid rounds and case conferences, which heightened staff awareness and created a proactive rather than reactive response to NDIS discharge planning. Alongside this point, an early start, meaning discharge planning right at the point of admission, was essential. This meant a culture change, particularly for acute clinicians who should be determining eligibility and starting access or identifying the need for an unscheduled plan review. This is to avoid unnecessary delays and impact on length of stay due to timeframes of the NDIS processes. Collaborating with key NDIS stakeholders was another important capacity building step. Becoming familiar with local NDIS providers, and in particular support coordinators, was proven to achieve more timely and trusted outcomes. Having a local list of NDIS providers who work well with the health system was also found to be beneficial in streamlining practice. A comprehensive education and training program was evidenced to be so essential. Alongside this, the development of an NDIS orientation plan for new and rotating staff, and the implementation of an NDIS Champions Network to build sustainability and ensure knowledge spread across the organisation. Quality assurance processes were also necessary to ensure delays in progressing through the NDIS pathway are minimised. This includes the development of internal KPIs around timing of access and provision of supporting evidence, as well as getting champions to check NDIS reports to ensure the correct language was used and to guarantee best outcomes. Finally, collection of NDIS data assisted with identifying trends and monitoring timeframes, which we use to measure compliance to both internal and external NDIS KPIs, and highlighted the need for the application of escalation pathway when required. By implementing all of these NDIS capacity building blocks, it was proven to assist health networks to develop a strong NDIS and health interface. This could then be used as a platform to move to streamlining and maximising NDIS outcomes for people with a disability.
Thanks, Michelle. The collaborative discharge approach really builds on that capacity building framework, but then goes on to provide an approach that involves the collaboration between health clinicians, support coordinators, and housing and support providers. So all these groups working together with the NDIA to confirm and activate NDI supports for a person with a complex disability while they're in hospital. And really the CDA aims to streamline this process, reduce the delays from the NDIS, and reduce the numbers going into residential aged care because of a more effective housing outcome. So on the slide you'll have some key features of the CDA. Some of those features, and most of those features, will be described by our panellists today, but a couple of key ones to be aware of. That early engagement with the NDIS, including early access, followed by the use of an early interim plan that provides the funds for support coordination and early housing exploration. So providing examples to these will be done by the panel, along with examples of how to work with support coordinators across that interface with health and the NDIS, and early exploration of housing needs and preferences. So what we've done is giving you a little bit of the theory behind streamlining NDIS discharge practice. But we want to draw on some NDIS and health subject matter experts to provide their practice experience of the framework and of the collaborative discharge approach, known as the CDA. So in our panel, we have Ingrid Iandis, who is a social worker and a clinical lead in the subacute care from Northern Health in Victoria. Hi Ingrid.
Hi.
We have Catherine Kelly, who's joining us on webinar. So Catherine's just going to pop on her camera so she can say hello. Catherine is a speech pathologist who's currently working as the District NDIS Coordinator at Southwestern Sydney Local Health District. And we have Susan Curry. Susan is a neurological physiotherapist with the ABI community team at Alfred, and Suzanne led the CDA project at the Alfred Health. I'm going to hand over to Ingrid and Michelle now, who will start with sharing their stories of change.
Thanks, Virginia. So many thanks for joining us today, Ingrid. I'm really looking forward to hearing your experience of how Northern Health build their capacity in regards to the NDIS interface. So I've got a few questions for you, but my first question is, what did you find were the key barriers to building NDIS capacity in Northern Health?
I think to start with, we needed to accept that NDIS was not the old disability with a new name, that it was something that was a whole new language, a whole different way of how we worked with people with a disability. And we had to acknowledge that NDIS was here to stay, and that as professionals in the health service, we had a responsibility to be able to make it work. So I think that was the first step, is actually making sure that we were on with what the change was. And that was probably more difficult than what it sounds, because a lot of people, we weren't sure what the change was. We knew NDIS was coming. We had a lot of hope of what NDIS was going to bring, that it was going to be much better and much easier than the old system that we had. I think that we've had some really good outcomes, and there's been a whole lot of better, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was easier. So that bit sort of went. I think that the lack of resources was difficult for us at Northern Health as well. I think, just to explain a bit, Northern Health is a 5-campus hospital in northern metropolitan Melbourne, and it's not a tertiary hospital, it's a secondary hospital, so it's not one of the biggest hospitals in Melbourne, but it does have a large emergency department and subacute services, and we're also in a very unique position with a very multicultural group of patients that we work with over 106 different languages that come to our hospital, and we're in a massive growth corridor. So there's 6 growth corridors in Victoria, and our catchment covers 3 of those. So we're expecting really rapid growth with not the most massive of resources. So we really need to make sure that people get the best services in hospital, but also not stay there too long. It's really important for them and for us.
Yeah.
So I think that Northern Health didn't have a funded project position, and although that was difficult, I still think that we just needed to run with it. It was something that was affecting our patients, that as professionals we had a responsibility to them, and whether we had a paid profession or not, it was our ethical and professional responsibility to make sure that we made systems work. That's been very difficult at times, but I think we still have just needed to push through and make it happen. I think initially to Northern Health there was a large focus on Northern Health becoming a provider. So we're in a bit of a unique position that we actually provide a provider of NDIS as well, and just even getting their head around the difference between being a provider and actually interfacing with NDIS for our inpatients was rather a large hurdle, which we've sort of jumped over mostly now. So I think it wasn't until maybe a year or so into NDIS rolling out in our area that there was a real realisation that this was impacting our inpatients at Northern Health. And staff, I think, people were just grappling with whatever they could find. So whatever information they had, which may have come from their Facebook page or a friend or on the grapevine or whatever there was just lots of different pockets of little bits of information, whether it was not necessarily evidence-based or the right way to go about things, but people were just grasping at straws, I suppose, and had all these different bits of information and really trying to help each other to pull that information together. And we had no key documents, so we had some started where there was little subcommittees that were getting together to start to put together things, but there was nothing that was over health service wide that had been ratified. We had a policy. The policy, upon reading it, was really outdated because, as we all know, NDIS has moved really quickly and lots of changes. So it's was outdated when we started embarking on the journey with the Summer Foundation. And I think that going through this experience though really helped us to learn. Because I think we learned through a number of rejections. So people who had put in access requests and were getting rejections, or were getting plans that were really poorly funded and missed key items like accommodation for someone. So people were starting to see that they were going to have to adapt to this new service in order to get the best outcome for their patients. And I think that that we've sort of seen that the days of 24/7 supervision, when we were working in a medical model and a health and welfare model, that people tend to put the dots together, that if someone needed 24/7 supervision, that obviously meant they needed accommodation and someone to look after them for that period of time. But we've sort of learnt that we really need to be breaking that down into who, how much, what supports, and who and when, and how long are these going to take. And I suppose I had a little bit of a thing about National Disability Insurance Scheme, and I think it took us a long time to realise it was an insurance company rather than a scheme, rather than that health and welfare sort of model. And one example we've looked at is that, you know, if you have your house burgled, and you say to the put a claim in and say, oh yes, everything was taken, I need 100,000, you're probably not going to get that 100,000. But if you break it down to, you know, each individual item that was stolen, what make and model it was, and a current, you know, market quote on what that was worth, you probably still won't get your 100,000, but you'll probably get a lot more than what you would if you just put one whole claim in.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to think of this as an insurance scheme and prices attached to each item throughout the day. So, you know, having that realisation became was one of the barriers. Once people were able to realise the difference, I think we moved along a bit as well. I think in general too, staff just felt really overwhelmed. There was a real sense of feeling out of control. We did a bit of a snapshot of just collecting quotes that we were hearing around in our teams or in corridors or those sorts of things. What were some of the things we were hearing? And we were hearing things like, you know, when I hear the word NDIS, I just have a whole lot of anxiety. I don't have the answers. I feel out of control. I'm frustrated, disappointed, helpless. It's stressful. It's time-consuming. My whole job has changed. And I think one that caught the eyes of those and ears of those that needed to hear was that multiple people saying, I just want to quit my job because it's so different to what I was going to do. I suppose it was some of those words that got our higher executive and managers listening to what was happening for staff on the ground. It was a threat to the workforce that was there.
And I think, Ingrid, I remember you saying, you know, staff were saying, you know, I'm not a disability worker. You know, this is what why am I doing this work? So it was a huge, it's culture change for staff, to, you know, health clinicians to realise that, you know, NDIS is actually part of your core responsibilities now. And,
that's right.
That, you know, that change is quite significant, isn't it?
Definitely. And it was you know, on this date this will start, and all of a sudden it was there, you know. So I think it was a bit of a shock to people when it first came in. I think one of the other barriers too is that we were really used to working with one service, and we had disability services that we could ring. We knew people there. We had a clear escalation pathway. And they were service providers as well as accommodation providers. And so it was sort of a one phone number, whereas now we're actually having to look at how we actually develop relationship with multiple services and multiple accommodation agencies as well. So that was something that was very different and a bit of a barrier, because people wanted to, there was a constant request of what number do I ring? And wanting, how do we escalate this by ringing one number, you know, which just wasn't the case.
And escalation was a big issue, wasn't it, really?
Yes.
For a lot of health services, they weren't making any headway with the NDIS, and there was no way to expedite processes. No one was listening except So how did that was that how your experience at Northern Health?
Yes, definitely. So often, again, it was applying old systems to a new model. So constantly our executives say, well, who do you need to ring somebody, give me the phone number and I'll ring them. And there really was just the 1-800 number, but there has to be another number. Who's their executive? And it was just it was a different model. It was a different model. There wasn't the one number. It was really about, making building relationships and it was very different, and how we actually as a health service responded to that. It did take a while to get used to the fact that this was now different.
It was almost like a new partnership, wasn't it? But there was no relationships being forged because it felt like they were all very separate entities trying to navigate a bit of a rabbit warren.
Definitely. And often the rabbit warrens were blocked.
Oh, they were.
They didn't lead anywhere. That's right.
Exactly. So very frustrating for clinicians. And so if you think back now, what did you see as the essential building blocks for change that were required to build a strong health and NDIS interface that, I guess, what Northern Health is like now, I guess. So I think one of the key factors that we had was that we
we needed to engage all the key stakeholders. So there was really just a pocket of people who perhaps had a little bit of an interest, but it was about establishing relationships internally, even with people knowing that this was a health service-wide concern. But I think that the overall motivation for change was there because people really wanted to get the best outcomes for their patients. And I think in general, health professionals, that is really what drives them at work, is to actually get a really good outcome. We really thrive on those good stories of good outcomes. And that's what people wanted to do, and they wanted to know how to get to there. So that was really the motivation for change. And I think that we needed to, I think that having the gap analysis session that was run with the Summer Foundation was a really good way of opening people's eyes to what other gaps at Northern Health. But even to set that up, there was a step before that of engaging people to be interested enough to come along to a gap analysis. We were successful in getting a number of key stakeholders, and I think we really took off from that point where we could see that there was a whole lot of gaps that we needed to be filling at Northern Health. And that led to establishing a governance structure and having an executive lead. So Maria Tucker now is an executive director who has been really pivotal in getting messages up to different levels, and also keeping motivations up, and also getting getting things done from key people and several people rather than one person. So I think that's been really useful.
And I think with our experience of the leaving hospital well, which we engaged with Northern Health, that was, it really felt like a lot of it was bottom up. People were on the ground saying that there was a lot of impact on workload, but it was that higher level didn't understand or weren't putting, I guess, the energy required, or understood what was required in regards to the NDIS, the change, the change. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So I think forming that steering committee too was really helpful, because it was about getting people, and again, it doesn't just happen. It requires work, and it requires getting out there and speaking to people and encouraging them to be involved and to take on this responsibility. And so I think that getting over the barriers of this is not my role, but trying to get people to actually then become fully enmeshed in it it requires some work. And I think that setting up our steering committee, we were able to ensure that there was a whole cross section of the health service, and I think that has been really vital and really important to do. That everybody has then a bit of a different perspective on things that they can bring to the table, but also it means that they have a say. So that they have a say in what's changing in their particular pocket of the organisation. So on our steering committee, we have different levels of allied health and different disciplines. We have nursing, medical. We have cover from adult service as well as paediatric services. We have our ACAS team, and we have also representatives from acute and subacute and community. So it's a real blend of people who come, and at different levels. So I think that's been really key in making things progress. I think that the other way that we've been able to build things is really just keeping NDIS in the discussion. So getting it out there wherever you can. If it's a newsletter, or if it's just talking about it for a minute at a meeting, maybe raising it wherever you can. And I think grabbing people's attention in the moment. So I think I can see a real pivotal point where we changed, where all of a sudden we'd gone from having 1 or 2 a year of people who were on disability to all of a sudden we had 13 people who were in our health service and couldn't go home unless they had NDIS. So people start to listen then, and that's when I think you jump, And even if it's not 13, even if it's 1, but been a difficult experience where someone's come into the health service and there just seems to be no answers. And if you can provide some part of the answer or engage in someone, it's sort of get them when they're down.
And what were the other elements that you've put into place?
So lots of other things. I think that having the key documents that Michelle outlined in her introduction, getting those up and running, so everybody had a structure to work towards and something to reference. Everyone then was starting to talk the same language. I think that we also had, and I think in doing that is not needing to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of health services out there that have really good policy, and I think it's really important that we all share those resources, and being open to one another, taking the best from each person. I think that then having the documents also gave people confidence that they actually knew, that they had some knowledge and something was in their control by having these documents. But I think also the real key turnaround was when we had the Summer Foundation training. The foundation training was really a really good opportunity to upskill people, and people, the buzz in the health service after the training was just really fantastic. People starting to feel confident and knowing what to do. And I suppose one of the cases that we had where we had just before the education, we had people at total loss of how they were going to discharge a very young person who had a condition that meant that her disability wasn't present at all times, but when it was vital that someone was there. So you couldn't actually, it was hard to actually argue of why she needed 24-hour supports when she didn't all the time. But through, they had no idea where to start. Went to the training, started doing the reports because they'd learned how to do it, building the evidence. Worked with the Summer Foundation as a consultation, which then led to this person going home with the supports that she needed. So that was fantastic. I think that, and a website where we've been able to put everything on top, put everything out there that everyone can access is really important too.
Yeah. And I know you did a lot of work putting together a champion network as well, which and also even thinking about that train the trainer type model, so getting some real experts within your organisation that can then build the capacity of your other health, the other staff. Which so that commitment, and Ingrid didn't say herself, but I think she took the role on unpaid on top of her her role to drive the NDIS, and I think really what we've found in our experience is that you need someone to be that driver, and so Ingrid's done an amazing job.
Thank you, Michelle.
In the success of Northern Health capacity building has been because there's someone to really who's got who is enthusiastic and committed to the cause. So the final question I'm going to ask you, Ingrid, and I think we've got 1 minute left. What further work do you think Northern Health needs to do to streamline and maximise discharge outcomes for people with a disability?
Yeah, so I think that we've done a lot of this work, but we really need to make it sustainable now, and we really need to get it out there. The groundwork's been there, the pathway's been laid, but we now need to walk the path, so to speak. So I think doing the Train the Trainer, which again, we put a call out for Train the Trainer. Often I was expecting not much of a response, but we had, I think it was 17 people put their hand up and say, I really want to do that, and the reason I want to do it is because I don't want to feel the way that other people did when I was in that point without training. So that will be really good. I think we need to engage our nursing staff more and to understand the 24-hour care plans, who have that expert knowledge of what the practical needs are. I think, definitely we have the champion group email working, but I'd really love to get other people responding and putting up information on that as well. So anyone at Northern Health, if you have those, bits and snippets, really share it with everybody else. It's not just that I send information out, rather that it becomes a real communication tool. So again, we have it, but we could do it better. I think that we need to get as many people to have heard the Summer Foundation videos, which is the 4 quick videos, but really just to build that basic level understanding across people who perhaps don't interface with NDIS every day, and maybe who are not allied health. It's a really good start to just understand the basics of NDIS. And I think too we need to further explore the impacts of of NDIS on the workforce, and we are involved in a research project that has been put on pause because of COVID. However, it's called WIN, which is going to be looking at that very thing, the impact of it's called the workforce impacts with interfacing with NDIS, and that's joint with Melbourne Health and Melbourne Uni as well as Northern Health. So I think, but I think I would just encourage people too that get out there, go to forums like these, speak to people. Don't be shy to ask the question, because many of us don't always know the answer.
No.
And it's through that collaboration of speaking to one another we might be able to nut it out between us. Things do change. They won't be the same as yesterday or the same as the person who you spoke to on the phone yesterday at NDIS. And, just have to just keep the conversation up.
Yeah.
I think is and we'll keep doing that and move forward.
Thanks, Ingrid.
Thank you, Michelle.
Hi everyone, back to me. Great examples of that capacity building and moving to embedding change. Thanks very much. We're going to kind of focus a little bit more on streamlining practice now and that streamlining practice via the collaborative discharge approach. So the fact I have Suzanne here next to me today, socially distanced of course, but I have Catherine via webinar in Sydney, really reflecting that flexibility in how we're working. But I'm going to start with the first question to Suzanne. Can you describe the key elements of the CDA, the collaborative discharge approach, that you implemented within your streams at Alfred Health, and how was it implemented?
Yeah, thank you. So a key element, as you mentioned earlier, was about the early engagement of the NDIS. So starting that process as early as possible. So at Alfred Health at the subacute site have some really good processes in place to flag the need for early access, and that's within journey board, morning team discussions, and also then having multiple conversations about which stage of the journey is the participant up to. At the early access point, we also mentioned about whether someone would be eligible for the complex pathway through NDIS. And that's really important to do early on to ensure that there's no delays in discharging further down the track. We also have senior clinicians who review the access request forms to ensure that they meet legislation first time.
Great. So really great work there around access. What are some other key elements of the CDA you feel that you've been able to implement?
Yeah, so throughout the project, we've run secondary consultation sessions. So these are cross-stream collaboration sessions between the aged care, the rehab and the ABI unit within our subacute site at Alfred Health. And within those sessions, we really guided clinicians' clinical reasoning around exploring housing needs and preferences of the participant. So we would really brainstorm different ideas about what discharge locations were out there, or what supports would be able to be justified and meet needs and necessary to support a feasible discharge for the participant. And ensuring that there was then consistency across the streams as well. Within the sessions, we also spoke about encouraging MDT discussions, so taken back to the different streams about engaging all the teams that are involved in discharge planning. So was there behaviours of concern that required neuropsychology input, or what was the mobility status, and all, ensuring that the whole team were having robust discussions about what the exact needs of the participant were.
So it sounds like that housing needs and preferences conversation was starting to become a key element for you at Alfred. I know you did some work with support coordinators. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously we know how important the early engagement of support coordinators is, and we had some really key champions that embraced the collaborative practice with support coordinators within the streams, and we really tried to enhance the early discussions with them, ensure that everyone was on the same page to facilitate the discharge moving forward. and ensure that that everyone had a good understanding about what the discharge goal was for the participant.
Great. Just anything else you want to say about the support coordinators in terms of an outcome that was achieved because of that early collaboration?
We actually had a clinician just a couple of days ago told us of a really great outcome that she's had, where she really showed how empowering the participant and their family really worked. So the occupational therapist provided different examples of support coordinators that were out in the community, provided that list to the participant and their family, and really empowered them to go out and do the phone calls, do the searching, and see who they really built up a rapport with and who they engaged with. And then that really straight away built that rapport and that trust between the participant and the support coordinator. Like, kind of with health in the background, then the participant was able to come back with the support coordinator in tow and say, right, we've looked at my supports that are out in the community, and in this case he was able to return home with a adequate support package and avoid residential aged care.
Great outcome. So I'm going to come back to you, but I'm now going to go to Catherine Kelly in Sydney. And Catherine, for Southwestern Sydney, you worked more across sites in your implementation of the CDA. Can you describe some of the key elements that you implemented and how was it implemented?
Hi everyone. So yes, we decided to work across our whole local health district, which consists of about 6 facilities. Another private facility that we have a service level agreement with. We've also got some specialist statewide units. We have a brain injury rehabilitation unit. We cover metropolitan, rural areas. We have enormous amounts of variation in socioeconomic status and health vulnerability. So just to give a bit of a picture of where we're working, and we know that really across our district we'll be working with upwards of 70 admitted NDIS participants at any one time going through the process. So really getting a good broad reach across the district was fundamental for us. And we used a champions model. So we recruited champions from within social work and occupational therapy across sites and services, specific services, as it was going to be appropriate. And a huge shout out to any of the champions in Southwestern Sydney if they've joined us today, because we wouldn't have succeeded without you. And so those champions were trained up through the education sessions that we did with the team from the Summer Foundation, and really set up to be the subject matter experts who would then disseminate information and basically build the process together as well. So really they're the brains trust. We realise no one person knows everything about how to do this, so we need a good mix of people who know a lot about the process to teach and learn from each other. So the key things that we implemented through that process were very similar to what Ingrid and Suzanne have already spoken about. So a real emphasis on early identification of people who will require NDIS supports for discharge, particularly in the acute environment, because of course we were going to discharge a lot of people from the acute environment, but also getting started early so that people move to subacute and rehab environments with the process already in progress. And we were definitely successful in that. That's why we're now identifying upwards of 70, because we know they're there and we've started the process. Early and meaningful engagement with support coordinators was fundamental for us, and really seeing our position as a partner with the participant and their support coordinator for working through the process successfully. Really enhancing multidisciplinary comprehensive pre-planning was also really important for us. And, we like to think we work very well in a multidisciplinary model and we work together well, but we really just needed to level up and pull all of our evidence together really effectively and have really thought through what a person needed and where they might be going at the point of discharge. So again, that really early exploration of a person's housing needs and preferences, and thinking big and wide about that, not just thinking about the old model that was available to young people with disability. So if you could go home with this many supports that were available, you could go home, and if not, you were going to residential aged care. Pushing past that and thinking, you know, how do we get people back to their own homes? What other housing options are there? Not necessarily always defaulting to, you know, supported independent living and group home models where there was something else that was going to be, you know, more to the person's needs and preferences. Also thinking through interim plans and what they really needed to be for an individual person, and whether it was worthwhile going to an interim plan at all, whether the first plan was being viewed as the one that would transition them from hospital if, you know, they were ready and we knew what the supports were going to need, versus people who really did need a more complex piece of planning for discharge. And embedded in that were new things that, you know, we've discovered we hadn't really been thinking much about before, like the need for behaviour support plans early on in the process to support that housing exploration. And, you know, better tools around doing that exploration of housing options, and more knowledge about what was out there. So they were all kind of key pieces of the process. I think if we'd focused on one of them instead of focusing on all of them, we wouldn't have been as successful. In
Great example of the breadth of those elements that you used. I'm going to come back to you, Catherine, but my next question is to Suzanne, so you can think about this, you get some extra thinking time. Suzanne, I'm asking you about, can you just describe the actual impact of the use of the CDA, the impact it made on discharge practice and patient outcomes? Any examples you have of that?
Yeah, so actually we have one really great example that has come about recently that I would like to share today. It's a young lady who was within our acquired brain injury rehabilitation unit. She was a young lady who early from the onset, the team acknowledged she would meet the eligibility for SDA and would actually require SDA to be discharged from hospital. It was very clear that she was unable to go home due to certain factors. So the team facilitated a SDA application through NDIS to meet eligibility, and she did get that funding approved. Now, unfortunately, that just was happening as COVID came along, so she was unfortunately unable to go to her SDA of choice that was near her family, friends and support. So she was then really at risk of either being discharged to residential aged care, super social isolation, and her young sons were unable to come and visit as frequently as she would have wanted. So the team within the unit really heavily advocated for the inclusion of MTA within her plan, so medium-term accommodation, and thankfully that was approved and that was popped into her plan. So she was actually able to go as an interim accommodation while she waits for her SDA. She was able to go into a Quest apartment with the appropriate supports that she requires, which is then in her suburb of choice, which is great, and near her all her support networks with her sons visiting every day. So that's great.
Great outcomes. Catherine, I know I've recently spoken to your staff at South Western Sydney and talked about some similar examples of avoiding residential aged care and moving towards their housing preference of choice. Your thoughts around the impact of the CDA on patient outcomes and on that discharge process?
Yeah, it's had an enormous impact, actually. And I think the key impact that's had the impact for the participants is that our staff are way more confident. They feel much better equipped to talk through this process and what individual people want and need. And they also feel much more confident in having, good engagement with support coordinators and with representatives of the agency And so I think that's fundamental. That's the key bit. And so what that's allowed to happen is that we have had people go back to their own homes where realistically I think they probably would have ended up in a much more restrictive housing model and potentially residential aged care, particularly those with extraordinarily high support needs, and also being able to approach that from the perspective of trialling people at home, knowing that this movement home was a trial, and that there was some contingency planning for the future if that trial didn't actually work out. And so that's fantastic. We've actually started to have people become eligible for SDA and being able to access SDA where that wasn't happening so much from hospital before. And there's still heaps of work to do there. And I think the other impact is, like I've mentioned before, the amount of collaboration between the disciplines for planning and working together has just grown and grown and grown. The other impact for the local health district has been, and for the participants, has been that they've actually been moving through the process more quickly. We've got data to show that while we were implementing this process, the amount of time people were spending at each particular point in the process reduced. And that's just gone from strength to strength with even more of the flexible processes that have come in place through COVID. And I think what we were able to put in place during this project has put our district in a strong position to be able to engage with those things meaningfully. And it gave us better consistency in process as well. So, building resources and practice guides and things, that's really helped to consolidate our processes much more than they were before. And that's something I really love to do more work with our health liaison officers in New South Wales when we move to a business as usual model, because my goal is really around making sure that whatever we do, works in lockstep for the participants. So, good coordination means that participants get really good outcomes and are not staying in hospital for a long time and are, being able to access an outcome that's really much better for them.
You mentioned the HLO. I was just going to just go to Suzanne if she's got an experience of how the HLO, the Health Liaison Officer, has been working at your site.
Well, even in the example that I just gave about the lady in the ABI unit, she the engagement with the support coordinator and then the health liaison officer within Alfred Health, to have that engagement and that clear communication, lines of communication with the NDIS local office was really valuable, so that everyone was clear in the process and clear that there wasn't any hurdles or any stumbling blocks along the way. It meant that it was like a streamlined process.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here because I haven't asked you this question before, but the fact that you had some streamlined process beforehand through some of the elements of the CDA, has that, what's been the impact then of your uptake of the use of the HLO?
Yeah, I think because we already had processes in place around the access, and so in our pre-planning document, so we already had an MDT pre-planning document that the team contributed to. I think that those processes were in place that then meant the HLO could come on and it would be really clear that the teams knew what they were working towards, and then they enhanced that communication. And also then that she's been really useful in telling us what we're missing and providing a bit of capacity building as well, to say, okay, you could word this a little, or they're wanting to hear X, Y, and Z. So, yeah.
Your thoughts, Catherine, on the HLO and your practice leading to that, whether that improved that interface?
I'm hopeful that it did. I guess as distinct from Victoria, New South Wales is not quite as far along as with the implementation of the HLOs. That was being done just as COVID hit. So we're kind of, New South Wales is still working out what the model is going to look like from the future. But I think having staff who understood the process and the language and working as well as possible can only be an advantage. But I think for us, it's maybe a little bit too early to answer that question.
Sure.
Yeah.
I know the idea of streamlined practice never goes away. We're constantly developing, and my question to you is, where do you think Southwestern Sydney now has to go to continue to streamline practice?
Oh, absolutely. There's always heaps to do, which is fantastic in many ways. So we need to, I think, spend a little bit more time refining and developing our resources that we developed during this project. So we've got our practice guide, we've got a lot of templates and things that work really well, but building on that and building that to, I guess, more comprehensive policy. We have to do a huge shout out to 2 of the OTs in our district who have just picked up doing more of that in the last little while, which is fantastic. And making that sustainable at a district level is also important. So thinking about how we do ongoing education and capacity building within our district around that as well. We're also keen to do to really build even more on relationships with support coordinators. There are a couple of support coordinators that seem to be doing a lot of work in our district now. And also I know a lot that are quite keen to work in the health interface space. So we're thinking about how we engage on a regular basis with support coordinators and share information about the health environment and how we work effectively in the health environment as well. So they're just a few things on the list, but we're going to keep finding them. Every time something changes, there'll be something new to do, and it's about being responsive to that, and changing and building our process around that.
Yeah, great. Mm-hmm. Suzanne, your thoughts around where to do more streamlining practice for Alfred?
Yeah, so I think the health services have done such an amazing job to develop and adapt to support participants through the NDIS. But I do think that the engagement with support coordinators, although we've all fed back that there has been some wins on that, I think there is some work still needs to be done to cement those processes. And build that collaboration. So we've been working to develop a working collaborative agreement document, which is just really a practical document to provide an opportunity for open and transparent discussions between health, the participant, the external providers, including the support coordinator. And that's really to ensure that everyone knows who's doing what in the discharge planning process, and reduce the risk of disjointed practices. So that's probably one example.
Great. I'm going to throw back to Catherine, because I know you started to do some work with engaging in housing providers, and certainly COVID just put a hold on a lot of things. But how have you engaged with housing providers, and what are you looking for in the future?
Good question. We had a bit of a view of maybe doing some regular forum work with housing providers as well. One of the challenges in Southwestern Sydney, it's a good thing and a challenging thing at the same time, because Southwestern Sydney has obviously a large population, but also is one of the areas where there is affordable housing in the Sydney area. There's been a lot of movement of providers, particularly housing providers, into the area. So there are actually huge numbers, and it's a bit tricky to coordinate with all of them. But in the meantime, and again, our New South Wales Ministry of Health has done some phenomenal things recently in engaging with multiple SIL and SDA providers in New South Wales, and so that's really become a phenomenal vehicle for communication with those providers. So for us in Southwestern Sydney, I think it's time for a bit of a rethink of what we might do around engagement with housing providers in the longer term. So not sure, but going to think some more.
Yeah, great. And you talked about sort of that early exploration of housing needs and preferences. and yet that is difficult to embed in practice. Have you got any thoughts around where you want to take that, or strategies for making that happen?
I think maybe building on what we did as part of the project, because that was really kind of towards the end. So we were starting to, we developed some tools to support people around exploring housing needs and preferences, and they have been picked up and used well, but I think the really detailed exploration of housing needs and preferences very, very early on is maybe something we just need to focus on a little bit more at this stage, to then know what we build on with that. So, for example, we've got an interview template that helps people shape their conversations with participants. We've got a template for thinking through the SDA rules and how they may or may not apply for a participant. So I think just a bit more consolidation in that space is really where we need to go with that at the moment.
And I know, Suzanne, you've got a couple of ideas around that, and just starting small around that housing goal in the pre-planning work.
Yeah, I think that would be a key area, is to think about the housing goal. So obviously the discharge goal, but also if the discharge goal can't quite meet exactly what the exact preference is of the participant, making sure that there's a real clear long-term goal within the plan, documented and communicated. So, and that takes it past age-appropriate accommodation is the goal. It needs to really look in to see the suburb the patient wants to live in, the support networks, the areas that they want to be around, and that's what then forms a real goal that the NDIS can listen to and take note of, and then provide the adequate supports to meet that goal.
That's right. We all know that it has to start with a goal. Mm-hmm. Funds need to be approved according to a person's goal. Mm-hmm. And that was a really great example of not us just going beyond that word of age-appropriate housing and support to really thinking about more details there. Yeah. We are coming to the end of just this section where we're talking about CDA, but we will move to a more panel discussion Q&A where you guys' jobs aren't finished yet. I'm sure there'll be questions and people want more details. So we will join you in as required. Thanks so much, though, for that really great detail around the work of the collaborative discharge approach on your sites and what that looked like. I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to make sense of some questions by the looks of that.
Well, it looks like we've got quite a few questions that have come through. So our moderators teams have kind of ranked them in terms of providing me with the top 6 here. So, and we've got a mixture of capacity building and streamlining or CDA questions. And I'm going to start. The first question that we had off the rank was, does Northern Health have a protocol for NDIS providers coming into the hospital to support patients with concurrent supports? So I'll hand it to you, Ingrid. Yeah.
Well, at the moment we are working on that. We do have a policy around looking at contractors coming onto, or people who do single shifts, so it's a broader policy around a number of people who come onto our grounds. And so we are looking at how that can be adapted, or if we can use the same one in relation to service providers coming onto Northern Health to work with patients. But in the meantime, service providers do come on and assist, particularly for our longer stay patients, for recreational sort of type supports and community access, those sorts of things. That we do have that happening, and we do have some practices in place to ensure that that they are appropriate and are who they are. They say they are. Yeah.
And I think, I guess, in terms of the Leaving Hospital Well project, it was a question that we did ask a lot of the health services that we engaged with, and it was pretty much across the board that no health service currently had a policy in place. I do believe that there is several Victorian health services that are working together currently. I think maybe Alfred, Eastern,
Yeah.
Austin.
Yeah.
Sorry if I've missed anyone, maybe Monash, and working on a policy that can be shared, I guess, across health services, because as Ingrid said,
And those Health Network Northern Health has we were going down that track, and we took it to our steering committee, and that's where we discovered that perhaps we already had something similar, which we actually didn't even know we had. So that's a bonus of a steering committee.
So I think just recognising that that's definitely an area for growth, and I guess and sharing of information and knowledge out there. So next question, I'm going to go over to streamlining. So if you could give one message to all health practitioners listening about discharge planning in the NDIS context, what would that be? Jen, I'm going to throw that to you.
Okay, can you repeat that question?
So, if you can give one message to all health practitioners listening about discharge planning in the NDIS context, what would that be?
Collaborate. Of course I'm going to say that.
And empowerment. And empowerment.
Empowerment, absolutely. Empower the participant and collaborate and help. Health can't do this by themselves. We absolutely have to engage with the agency, and we get the best outcomes when that engagement occurs, and we get the best outcomes when we become equal partners. Catherine, over to you. You guys are doing this really well.
You beat me to it. I was going to say collaborate as well. See yourself as partners in the process. But what I might add on to that is it goes without saying, but keep the person at the centre of what you're doing as part of that collaboration.
Yeah, great. And I think I heard whispering in my ear over here was the early start. Yeah. So, in making sure that it is a core responsibility of all health professionals. I think probably I'll just add, having an understanding of that legislation. I think that's a real new learnings for health. But if we understand that legislation, we actually have so much opportunity to test the scheme and to push it and create the outcomes that we want. That was a really good question. So the other question is, what's the biggest thing you did to get staff on board with grasping NDIS and adjusting their practice? I'm going to ask you this, Ingrid.
Well, I think was just about that talking about it, to actually to just have the conversations, to really highlight when something had gone well, and I think encouraging people to also take some responsibility for their own learning. So. And putting things out that could help that. So, sharing resources or sharing a website or a new tip or something that's happened in recent times. So I think it really is about having the discussions and sharing information.
Yeah, and I think in terms of my experience, I think having that higher level support to
definitely,
if you're kind of trying to drive that change is really important. But also understanding what the roles and responsibilities of health is. And I know within the DHHS in Victoria, we had some clear practice guidelines that really stipulated that our role as health professionals is to support people along every stage of the NDIS pathway, and instead of sticking our head in the ground, we actually have to take ownership of that and say, it's not something that we can ignore. We need to be responsible for that. What I'll do.
Putting you on the spot.
Can you comment on your journey of engaging with support coordinators? And I might ask you this, Suzanne.
Yeah. So I think as we've spoken about a little bit, I think there has been some key people, there's been some key champions within Alfred Health that have engaged with working with support coordinators and have built in their confidence in working with support coordinators and what support coordinators can bring to the discussion and their skills and expertise. I think we've obviously got some work to do on just cementing that process and cementing that open dialogue between all the parties involved. But I think it's really important to also say that sharing the good news stories, so the different teams talking about their experience, like Ingrid just mentioned there, about that resource sharing, and this worked and that support coordinator worked really well with this participant, and just that matching can be really beneficial. So I think the more that clinicians talk about their good news stories and recommend and say how they've been working for them is really beneficial.
And I'm going to flip that question on its head a little bit and say, how did you overcome perhaps some of the challenges of working with support coordinators that didn't understand health?
Yeah, so I think it's just having that real open and respectful conversation about okay, so this is what health, how our process allows or our process occurs to enhance the discharge planning, and then allowing for that reciprocal discussion between the two. Sometimes when that discussion doesn't happen, it can be kind of health telling support coordinators what to do, or sometimes support coordinators, they have obviously the experience out in the community about what is out there, but if sometimes there's been experiences historically where they might go off in a wee direction that might not marry up with what health's vision of the discharge to support the participant is. So then you're going off in two different streams and not working collaboratively, and then that's just a waste of resources. It reduces. It means that people have prolonged admissions in hospital when they don't need to. Yeah.
So, Virginia, did you want to?
I was just going to bring in Catherine, because Catherine's sites have had some experience of using support coordinators early. Before plans are approved, anyone working in any of the HLOs can just cover their ears right now. But do you want to share some of that? How that kind of came about in Sydney?
In our project in Sydney, we had a couple of support coordinators that joined us through a Summer Foundation Expression of Interest process, who were part of the co-design of our processes. And so they were also support coordinators who were willing to be engaged by a participant early, on the basis of a prediction that the person was probably going to be a reasonable and necessary support for that individual person. I know that's not ideal in terms of process, but the value that gave us was learning from support coordinator expertise, particularly early on in the process. We had some very strong, very skilled support coordinators as part of the project, and so having them engaged in early pre-planning work helped to build our staff's capacity in pre-planning by understanding what needed to happen, what we needed to consider, what evidence we needed to gather, what would happen after planning. So it allowed kind of forward planning in the broader sense to start really early and really skill our staff up in that area. And so that's been incredibly beneficial from that perspective.
Totally agree, and I think that development of confidence from staff really, some of that came about by having really great conversations with support coordinators who they're experts in NDIS. That's what they do.
Absolutely, and again, that is something that was fundamental. If we hadn't had that, we wouldn't have made as much progress as we did. And it's not to say that we didn't have speed bumps, because we did, and we do. And that's the nature of working collaboratively. But I think some of the key things too was really appreciating that support coordinators came from a range of different organisations, from a range of different backgrounds, and to not come to the relationship with a support coordinator with a set of expectations, and that communication and negotiation really early on, whenever you first engage with the support coordinator, and if it's a participant who's a person who's already a participant and they come into hospital and they have their support coordinator, get started on that conversation early, and do some negotiation around how you're going to work together. So what are your expectations of each other? Who's going to do what? How are you going to communicate? What are the time frame expectations for communication? What will you do if there's something not working well with either party or with the relationship? How will you resolve that? And I developed up some resources that staff could use to set that relationship up. So a collaborative working agreement. I'm an allied health professional. You know, a supervision agreement is something we're pretty used to. So we took the idea of a supervision agreement that we use with our staff into a collaborative working agreement that you would negotiate with a support coordinator or potentially any other provider that you're going to be working collaboratively with. So you'd planned for some of those things that create unanticipated speed bumps. Like even things like, well, what happens over Christmas? You know, does that particular organisation continue to operate over Christmas? Do they do a shutdown over? Like things that you don't necessarily think about, but have a huge bearing on how successfully you continue to work. Yeah. So yeah, bottom line, set up the relationship well with a support coordinator and you're really in a really strong position.
Catherine, I've got another question for you. How did you, I know you at Southwestern City, you had a whole of hospital approach in regards to the CDA and streamlining practice. What was your, I guess, technique in engaging acute clinicians? Because that's been a challenge across many health services. And I'd be really keen to hear your experience.
That's a good question. I think we did lots of things. We had engagement from an executive level, particularly the allied health executive, because a lot of the work was going to be done within allied health. So it was recognised as something that was important, and it was a burning platform for us because it was something we were struggling with before we started the project. And so we just made the call that we were going to include everyone, that it wasn't going to focus on a particular service or a particular department or a particular facility. We made the call it was going to be everyone, and many of the champions are experienced clinicians who are used to working with each other across the district and across services. So that was really helpful. We were really starting from a strong position there. And particularly because some of our acute environments, many of our participants were being discharged from acute environments. They weren't going to subacute locations or rehab. We have very finite numbers of beds within our district, of course, as everyone does, but there are a finite number of beds, so not everyone was going to go there. So, it was to the advantage of the acute facilities to be doing this process well, to support their own discharges. And then what grew out of that was the coordination between the acute and the subacute rehab environments, sort of recognising the value in just working together. One of our subacute facilities is linked. It's operationally run as a single facility with the acute hospital, and so the clinicians come from the same department. So that's very easy there. It was kind of happening already. Some of the other locations, people recognise the value in really good coordination of care and just did it, which is because that's amazing, and they did it. This is fantastic. And we've got a few processes that sit around that too. So at some of our facilities, or at pretty much all of our facilities now, we have a regular discussion of the NDIS participants there. And so a facility that has an acute and a subacute element are present in the same discussion. And so that's really helpful because you're starting to you're considering the whole journey, the whole bigger episode of care from the outset. And so the subacute teams are more aware of what's coming and what's being done, and there's a good smooth handover of that process.
What have you found helpful to actually find available housing for patients? Suzanne, I might put that over to you. How have you found housing? Or, what platforms have you used?
Yeah, well, so obviously the Housing Hub has been a great resource that we've been introduced to throughout this process, but also we were really lucky within the project to have linked in with the Housing Brokerage Service run through Summer Foundation to work on a couple of with a couple of tricky cases that had complex discharge planning. So within that, it was just lots of liaison with the support coordinator and their networks out with in the community, and also just brainstorming lots of different ideas for discharge location. Do you have anything?
I would just say that you really did that with a really multidisciplinary approach, and that was probably a little bit different.
Yeah.
That's what you noted to me, that everyone being on board talking about housing, it's not always been that way.
Yeah, no, yeah.
The more brains and the more ideas and creative ideas you have behind that, and with absolutely the person and the support coordinator in the centre of that.
I'm going to actually throw over to Ingrid now, because I think in terms of your journey at Northern Health, you've done that capacity building, and now to move forward and I guess to streamline practice. Where does housing sit for you at Northern Health?
So again, I think just before COVID, which has changed plans for a lot of us, is we were looking at having some sort of housing forum, because we are getting approached by a number of different housing providers, and it's actually really difficult to determine what they can provide or what they can't, and those sorts of things. So we're hopeful that we still be able to have such a forum where we can actually connect. We do need to do some work in that area of connecting with our local housing providers, and same with our local support coordinators. We need to do that further work.
Yeah. Do you think, that the growth, that's an area in capacity building that's required still at Northern Health?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think we have had some successful stories of people moving into SDA. So just recently we had a young man who, coming into the health service at 33, I suppose there was a thought that there was nowhere for him, and that nursing home would have been the outcome. And through developing relationships with support coordinators and empowering his mother as well as himself, we really had a happy story of him going to SDA from hospital and not going to residential care, and that's been a really good outcome. So
Thanks.
But it is an area we need to do further work on.
Like many health services.
But we are hearing of them building in our area, so that's really exciting that that's happening.
It's been a slow sort of moving feast, really.
And we know that the Housing Hub is changing their platform all the time and re-embedding themselves and looking at things like housing profiles coming on the Housing Hub and different ways of searching now on the Housing Hub. So, and absolutely there's other platforms out there like GoNest as well. So it is about using all resources available to us, isn't it? Yeah.
You got a question there, Jim?
Are you done?
Yes, I'm done.
Okay, this is a really tricky one, and we might just because there's still one last question I want to ask you guys. So it's the question is around clarifying your experience with that concept of, this is the question of double dipping with rehab services and NDIS services. Some providers are saying no. I'm trying to sort of kind of make sense of that question, but it may be that idea of still being clear around when rehab stops and other providers come on.
Yeah, we've recently had a few, and I don't think we've come to quite the conclusion of it yet, but definitely we're the ABI community team at Caulfield Hospital are a rehab service, so we're referred patients after patient stay once they've transitioned into the community for a 12-week goal cycle to work on specific rehab goals. And I think And then obviously there's NDIS funding that's approved for the participant when they leave hospital as well. So then there'll be an external, say, from a physio point of view, there's another external physiotherapist involved as well. And just that then, like communication about, okay, so what's the expectation from everyone, and where we've had one example just recently who he was discharged from Monash Health Service, and he had a really great NDIS plan in place and was discharged home. He came to us for a rehab burst, and then knowing that the NDIS the private clinicians are ready and waiting, they're going to have regular updates from us regarding how he's transitioned over the 12 weeks, and then be ready to go once that 12-week cycle's finished. But I think I don't know whether this has come from one of the team members, because we are still very much trying to work out how we fit into that landscape.
When rehab finishes and private providers start. Yes.
And I think it comes down to that COAG document where, in terms of the roles and responsibilities of health and other sectors. And I think health, we are responsible for rehabilitation, and that, the two can sit together at the same time. They don't have to, it's not double dipping. What the allied health professionals involved with and funded through the NDIS, it's about maintenance. So that is what their responsibility is, and that's what their funding is. So,
and I think also there's that capacity building that they can argue, the NDIS providers, that capacity building for economic and social participation that they may then move on to do. So I think there can be lines drawn. If you think about, if you go back to the COAG agreement, you go back to the legislation, and that's going to help you make those decisions as a service. At what point do we say we're done, and at what point providers kick in?
And do we work?
And how do we work together? Until we get to that point. I think we're going to have to start to finish up. There was a question I was going to ask you guys to finish, but I feel like we're nearly there. But maybe before we finish up, I just very quickly, if you were to think about where you're at now, your service and your sites, in that interface with NDIS for best practice discharge, 3 things that got you where you are now. 3 things, Suzanne?
I really think that sharing of good news stories, so those patient outcomes and clinicians just talking to each other about what has went well. Focusing on the house and preferences. I think really identifying that key preferenced for discharge goal, and the collaboration between the team members. So as you said, it wasn't a common practice. We would, but it's just taking that to the next level about, let's get the whole team talking about discharge location.
Fantastic. 3 things, Ingrid.
I think really for us, establishing the steering committee and having that executive involvement has been really vital. And I think also the pre-planning tool that actually people needing to, it's not only helping how to fill out the form, but it helps people change their thinking of how what they need to present. So I think the people doing that, and I think just celebrating the successes, I think is a really good way of learning, and it's my 3rd one.
Catherine, your 3 things.
I want to say what they said. Pretty much all of those things. But what I might add, just for a little bit extra, particularly around the use of the pre-planning tools, is better understanding of what's in the NDIS Act in terms of the access criteria and what reasonable and necessary means, and shaping our writing and our evidence around that was one of the huge turning points. So all the other things and that.
Fantastic. Thanks. I want to thank the 3 of you for joining us today. Your practice examples are amazing, and well done to you and your health service on your commitment to change. We hope today that you've been inspired by what's possible and been inspired by these stories of change and what's possible in moving from capacity building to embedding change to streamline practice. If you haven't joined our community practice, please do jump on the Slack channel and share your practice questions, ask the questions, encourage cross-hospital discussions, and we all learn from each other. We do have a Slido set up, so please, really take 1 minute to have at the end to think about, reflect on in the implementation of the capacity building framework, what's that going to look like for your site? In streamlining discharge practice, what can you do? What's a bit of a 3 actions from here that you can do? So we can't go today without saying a special thanks to Zoe and Vince, who were the logistic masterminds behind this all. You have no idea what this took to put this on today, so well done to them. Lastly, we'd like to say thanks to the practice team, a super team. I'm going to get a bit emotional because under the guidance of Tom Worsnop, he has been a great leader for us. The practice team, his work is showcased here today. So I'd like just the practice team to put on their cameras and give us a wave. So all of you can see the great work that's happened is all because of this great team, the practice team. Thank you all. Thanks for your time today and your participation. Good luck on your journey. Thanks everyone.